Okay, thanks everyone for joining us today. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Kate Tracy, and I'm the Communications Coordinator at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And today we'll be discussing our newly released report, Achieving 100% Clean Electricity in the Southeast, Enacting a Federal Clean Electricity Standard. This is one of 4 webinars that we are doing on the report. This one is focused on Southern Company. If you'd like to take a look at the 3 other utility systems that were analyzed in the report and their webinars, they will be loaded onto our website later today. And then we will also include recordings of each of them in a follow-up email that we'll send out later this afternoon. Just a few things, housekeeping things before we get started. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar. So if you have a question, please submit it using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. If you're with a media publication, if you could denote in your question who you are with, that would be great. And we will not be monitoring the chat for questions during the webinar. So please make sure that you're submitting those Q&A questions through that box. So without further ado, I'll get us started with passing it over to Steve Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. My name is Stephen Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. SACE is a nonprofit energy policy and environmental advocacy organization that does work throughout the Southeast United States. And you can see our mission here on the screen. Our focus is on reducing the environmental footprint of how we produce and consume energy in our region. And we are particularly focused on reducing carbon emissions. And so that's where we're going to focus today. We are in an unprecedented time. The President of the United States was just traveling in Europe with world leaders discussing rejoining the climate commitments that the world community has made. We're seeing unprecedented weather events, climate events across the globe. Here in the United States, the West is gripped in an unprecedented drought situation. We're seeing record temperatures, record heat waves. We're seeing unprecedented fires across the West. We're seeing all types of unusual events. Earlier in our series, we were talking about Florida and the vulnerability it has with its extensive coastline. Other parts of the Southeast have experienced ravaging floods. And now we're talking about the Southern Company territory, that you have unique treasures, special treasured places like Tybee Island that is experiencing issues with flooding and having to rethink infrastructure. And then we have some very large urban areas in the Southern Company footprint, Atlanta in particular, that we've seen, record heat waves that can be, devastating, putting stress on vulnerable populations. And these trends, unfortunately, are accelerating and increasing. And it has a very profound cost associated with it. Those costs aren't always internalized into the cost of electricity. And so, doing nothing on climate change is not an option. We've got to accelerate it. The benefit is that this country now is having, for the first time in a long time, a serious discussion about infrastructure. And part of that infrastructure discussion is actually looking at infrastructure that can actually be part of the solution with the climate crisis. One of the key components of that infrastructure bill that's being debated is the Clean Electricity Standard, and that's what we will focus in on today. And SACE and our team, Maggie Schober and a team of SACE staff have looked at a number of utilities. And so in our final webinar series, looking at the Clean Electricity Standard this afternoon, we're talking about Southern Company and the opportunities it has to lead. Having had several conversations with Tom Fanning on this, I'm excited that he's willing to have the dialogue. But as always, talk is cheap. We've got to see action, and we need leadership. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maggie and let her share some of the analysis of how we see Southern Company can really get out and lead by example on getting to zero carbon. Maggie?
Great. Thank you, Steve. All right. So with the stage set by Kate and Steve, a lot of what he mentioned is, why we're here, and we'll get into a little bit more of that. But first, let me give you a little roadmap on where we are going today. So I'll start out with a little bit of background about a clean electricity standard and what we did here, why we put together this this analysis and this report. Then I'll go through some of the results, some of the conclusions, and we will end with Q&A, hopefully, lots of good questions. This is the fourth one of these webinars. We're doing one for each of the utilities you see here, and we've had some really great questions, so please do keep those coming. You can see the Southern Company territory in the map here, but just, so folks that maybe are not familiar, we looked at all of Southern Company, so that's 3 operating utilities: Georgia Power, Alabama Power, and Mississippi Power, and they are in green in that map. All right, so what is this clean electricity standard thing we're hearing about? Well, a clean electricity standard is a policy mechanism that has 3 main elements. It's a policy that says that a certain geography or a certain entity has to achieve a certain percentage of their electricity from a set of defined resources by a deadline. So those are the 3 key elements. What resources qualify, what percent are we targeting, and when does that percent need to be achieved? Sometimes it's a single deadline, sometimes it's actually a timeline, so it's a percent for each year, and those ramp up over the years. This is a policy that's not new. There are over 30 states, territories, and DC that have policies like this in place. Maybe they are or are not called a clean electricity standard. Often they're called renewable portfolio standards, or RPS, and they're pretty widespread across the country, notably except for here in the Southeast. In the Southeast, really it's just North Carolina as a state, and as of earlier this year, the city of New Orleans. These are also not new policies. The first of these was actually set by Iowa in the early 80s. And so there are a number of states and utilities all across the country that do have experience with this kind of a policy. And then you'll see here on the right some of the current and recent proposals at the federal level for a clean electricity standard, starting with one from the Biden administration, 80% clean by 2030, 100% clean by 2035. And then I've added there a number of the different proposals by different members of Congress, either in this Congress or in the previous Congress. But suffice to say that this has gotten some interest at the federal level in both the administration and Congress over the last few years. So why are we looking at this now? Well, one reason is obviously the proposals at the federal level, as just mentioned on the previous slide. Also, as Steve went over, we're seeing more and more the impacts of climate change all across our region, country, all over the world. And so this is just becoming, more and more of an urgent matter. Also, why we specifically were looking at this is the fact that a federal policy like this, a federal clean electricity standard, would have an outsized impact on the Southeast. And there's 2 main reasons for that. The first is that we don't have a market here in the Southeast. And the second is that we don't have those state level policies. As I mentioned before, it's just North Carolina and New Orleans. And the reason that not being in a market is relevant here is that one of the trends we've seen in areas of the country, most of the rest of the country is actually under some sort of market construct. A lot of times these are called regional transmission organizations, or RTOs. And basically that's where there's an independent organization that oversees a market, and there's trading between utilities, independent owners of power plants. And under those constructs, we've seen that renewable energy, because it is the lowest cost resource, it really is flourishing more so than in most states that don't have this construct. The second piece is that we do see a lot fewer proposals of building new fossil gas in these markets, just because they're not expected to compete as much. So those are the two reasons why this kind of policy would have such a big impact here in the Southeast. So what did we sort of want to get out of doing this analysis? Well, we wanted to visualize what would it look like for the 4 largest utilities in the Southeast to operate in a scenario at 100% clean electricity. This is intended to be the beginning of a conversation and really start that conversation flowing between customers and policymakers, regulators, and utilities, and really shift the conversation away from, is this even possible? And towards, how do we get there? What are our different options? What are the pros and cons of the different pathways we can take? So I'll also mention up front that what this analysis is not. So this is not least cost optimization, which is a policy, or which is a method that's typically used for by utilities for their resource planning, or sometimes called IRPs, integrated resource planning. So we did not perform that kind of analysis. That's just not what we were going for. It's also a very resource and time intensive process. And then this is also not something where we looked really closely at power flow analysis or transmission. I think that'll kind of become obvious, how we did what we did in the next slide, but we weren't looking at power flows day to day, hour to hour, either within a utility or among utilities. We looked a little bit at some of the transmission constraints, but largely did this analysis outside of those outside of those models or those constraints. And then the last thing is that this report and this webinar shows some megawatt levels for different technologies. So there's so many megawatts of solar and so many megawatts of wind and all that. When we present these values, it's just important to keep in mind that these are not the maximum amount that can be achieved, but this is just a pathway that we've defined using this particular methodology. All right, so just going to hit on the high points of our method and assumptions. We do have a whole appendix dedicated to these in the report. So if that is your thing, I encourage you to go check it out. If you have questions on this, feel free to ask them here or send me an email after the fact. And I'm more than happy to kind of dive deep into these issues. So what did we assume? We assumed a 100% clean by 2035 across the board. And what do we mean by clean? For this analysis, we included wind, solar, energy efficiency, existing nuclear, existing hydro, and existing biomass. We did have a sort of other renewable, new other renewable resource, generic resource that we included that we used, very sparingly and didn't specify if that is biomass, if that is landfill, if that is geothermal, if that is, any sorts of other other renewable sources. But pretty important here is what clean does not include, and that is any kind of fossil that includes fossil gas. So we didn't include any gas, even with CCS or anything like that. There's no new nuclear, there's no new gas, and there's no CCS on existing gas. So what did we, how did we put these pathways together? So we started with Southern's own load forecast for each of its operating utilities and resource plans for operating utilities in 2035. And we just took out all the fossil resources again, take out all the coal, take out all the gas, take out all the oil, and anything that's left, we just left alone. Then we applied our distributed energy resource assumptions. This is your energy efficiency, your distributed solar, your demand response. Those are pretty generic terms, but what we mean by that is, so energy efficiency is traditional utility programs where you have, for instance, rebates on efficient appliances and whatnot, but it's also, more innovative ideas around rate design, around smart home programs that we're seeing across the country. With distributed solar, that's also a little bit more than just your residential solar on rooftops. It can include solar at commercial locations and other locations. It can be somewhat larger projects on the distribution grid, but not large enough to be on the transmission grid. So we have load forecast. We applied DERs that obviously meets some of your load needs. Next, we apply some wind assumptions. We have 3 types of wind. Western wind is assumed to come from, Oklahoma area and be brought in via transmission that is expanded beyond existing transmission. We have onshore wind, so that's assumed to be within the specific utility's territory. And then we have offshore wind for utilities where that is available. And then once we applied our wind assumptions, there were gaps in the amount of megawatt hours, the amount of energy needs for that year, and gaps in the capacity needed to meet reserve margin targets. And so we filled those with large scale solar, storage, and if needed, some of this other renewables category. Just as a quick 101 reserve margin, very simplistic view is that if you are planning a system and your peak of your utility is 100 megawatts and you have a reserve margin of 15%, that means you need to have 15% more capacity on your system than your peak. So you need to have 115 megawatts on your system there. So once we did all that, we had a sort of draft pathway, if you will, and we checked that against an hourly load for a peak winter day, a peak summer day, and also a typical spring day, just to be sure that this kind of pathway would be able to deliver enough power for the system in each hour of those peak days when the system is expected to be constrained. And I will show you guys some charts on what those look like, and I can talk about that a little bit more when we get into the results. So we had 2 main pathways that we looked at, and there are some similarities across the 2. There are some differences. We actually struggle a little bit with what to call these pathways, and I think that'll become clear as I talk about them. But we started out with the one on the left, which is a distributed energy resource or DER focused pathway. So this is one where energy efficiency and distributed solar meet about 1/3 of all energy needs for the whole year of 2035. So this is one where we are assuming a significant and also a sustained investment in these kinds of resources and programs by the utility starting immediately and through the year 2035. When we think about energy efficiency and distributed solar, it's really important to think about time, because if you think about it, in an energy efficiency program, if that program is helping folks that are replacing their AC to go, up a level and get a more efficient unit, then obviously not everybody is replacing their air conditioner every single year. And so you're going to have to have that program operating at that level for a number of years to capture a good amount of savings there. Similarly for solar, not everyone is able to look at or invest in solar on their rooftop or at their business in the same year. And so we want to have extended programs so that we can really capture the true benefits of those programs. And demand response is also a key part of this DER focused pathway. But we did, obviously, those three resources, the DERs themselves, they don't meet 100% of the needs. So we do add energy storage, onshore and offshore wind, and then some large scale solar to sort of complete the pathway there. So when we think about DERs and the fact that they would need this sort of sustained level investment, and we haven't historically seen that in the Southeast, particularly with some of the Southern companies operating utilities, and the region as a whole is, not is toward the bottom on energy efficiency savings generally, in particular, and also distributed solar. So we wanted to look at, well, what happens if the utilities don't meet those DERs, that level of DER penetration that we assumed in the DER focus pathway. So we looked at a second pathway. The DER assumptions here are still higher than in what the utility is currently planning to do between now and 2035. They're just not quite as high as the ones in the DER focus pathway. So here DER still meet about a fourth, between a fourth and a third of energy needs by 2035. That level of demand response is also lower. And so as we would expect, we have higher levels of the larger resources. So we called this the large scale renewable focus pathway. Again, both pathways have both distributed and large scale resources. Just the balance between the two is a little bit shifted. One has more of those DERs and one has not quite as much. So what did we learn from these pathways and from this experience? The first, probably very obvious, but this analysis made it clear that a variety of clean energy resources is needed to get to that 100% clean electricity goal. So you can't get there if you're only investing in solar. You can't get there if you're only investing in wind. You need a variety to get there. And then the second one, it's really important that we start immediately. As I said, with the DERs, the distributed programs, energy efficiency and distributed solar, it does take time to build up the energy savings or the capacity from those programs. But some of the large scale renewable projects and the level of large scale renewable additions in these pathways would also take the entire time that we have between now and 2035 to get there, especially when we're talking about transmission to connect to get that wind from Oklahoma into Southern companies' territory. Those projects do not happen quickly, and it's important to start them immediately. All right, so let's get into some of the results. So this first chart is the results from the DER focused pathway. You'll see the 3 bars on the left are the 3 Southern Company operating utilities and where they would be in 2035 under their current utility plans. So this isn't a snapshot of where they are today. This is a snapshot of where they would be in 2035, if things continue under their current plans. And then the 3 bars on the right are a snapshot of the capacity by different types under this DER pathway. So as you can see, the largest resource for any of these 3 is that solar resource that includes both the distributed solar and the large scale solar there. And I'll note the chart is based on capacity. What I'm going to talk about next is energy. So they're not quite the same thing, but energy efficiency is projected to meet about 21% of the total energy needs in 2035 for these 3 operating utilities, and that distributed solar meets about 10% of those energy needs. So that's where we get about to a third of total energy from those 2 resources. So the remainder is mostly met with large scale solar and wind. That wind is mostly both local and western wind. There's a small amount of offshore wind assumed here, and then there is storage. That gray at the top is storage. All right, so what would that look like during a typical day, or not a typical day, but a peak day? So first up is Georgia Power under a winter peak day condition, and this is from actual load data from Georgia Power from a peak day that they have experienced. So as you can see, the dark gray here is storage discharging, and so that helps with both the overnight to morning, and then starting back up in the evening and going back over the next night. You'll see the dotted line is where the load would have been, and then the solid line here just above the last wind resources, that is the load with storage charging. So when we were looking at these resources, we were using what sorts of technologies are available today. And when we're looking specifically at energy storage, we assumed a sort of generic energy storage resource. It could be a battery, it could be pumped hydro, it could be any sort of number of technologies. But we did assume that that's a short-term storage resource. So that means that we required that there be enough generation during each day to charge up those batteries for the amount that they would need to be discharged within that 24-hour period. One thing you'll see is on this winter peak day for Georgia Power, they do have some excess generation. That's this sort of transparent gray up at the top. This was pretty unique for Georgia Power. Georgia Power actually had excess generation in all 3 of the days that we looked at. And that is just because they did require a certain additional resources just to meet the annual load needs in Georgia Power service territory based on their load forecast. So and then we'll look at a summer peak day for Mississippi Power. This one is somewhat of a similar trend from Georgia Power, but you can see there's more of that what we call Midwest or Western wind resource there. That's that light purple, and then solar in both the light yellow is the distributed solar, and the dark yellow is the utility scale or large scale solar. And Mississippi Power does have some of that excess generation even on a summer peak day as well. And then the last one of these sort of daily charts that I'll show, this is Alabama Power during a spring day. So with utilities, typically the load is the lowest in the springtime and the fall. People are not using quite as much electricity, and generating sources, especially both wind and solar, tend to be they're still operating quite a bit, and so there is a lot more potential for this excess generation. One thing that you will notice is that there isn't any nuclear in this chart, but Alabama Power does have a nuclear power. And one thing that we found is that when you're building to meet peak load in the winter and the summer, you're building enough of these renewable resources, you can actually, and we found this in most utilities, were able to shut down their whole nuclear fleet in the springtime and the fall time, and that there could be some potential benefits to this. That's a good time to do some maintenance on the plants and that sort of thing. The exception to that was Georgia Power. They needed about 1 or 2 nuclear units to still be online operating, even in spring and fall times. And one last thing I'll say on this slide, where we're looking at the slides that show the excess generation, is this. Well, first, this is a different way of operating, on a day-to-day basis than the utility is currently operating, is used to operating. So this would be, a pretty big shift in day-to-day operations. This idea of having, this much excess generation, especially in the spring and the fall, could be a real opportunity because, there's just a lot of great possibilities for what do you do with this excess generation. Is this something where, you find certain kind of load that can, shift and operate when there is excess generation and turn down or turn off when there isn't? Is this a way to, charge up some sort of long-term storage, so you have to build less storage overall, but you can really charge it up in the spring, it'll be ready in the summer, you can charge it up again in the fall, and it'll be ready in the winter. There's a lot of great ideas out there on that, and we're really excited to see what happens in that space. All right, and then this is my last chart, but this is the results from the large scale renewable pathway, or LSR pathway, as we'll call it, I guess. So again, the same 3 bars on the left show the current utility plans for Alabama Power, Georgia Power, and Mississippi Power. And then on the right are the results under this specific scenario. So DER still meet a good amount, about 27% of energy needs by 2035. And the real differences between this one and the DER pathway on the large scale resources is that this pathway did require about 40% more in-region wind and 80% more off-region wind. Remember, I said there was only a little bit of offshore wind in that DER pathway, so we did assume quite a bit more of that here in this large scale renewable pathway. Interestingly about this one is that generally there was actually less solar and less storage needed than in the DER pathway. And again, that is because of more wind. As we especially see this with the more balanced portfolios are between solar and wind, because they have complementary profiles. So they're generating at different times. Wind tends to be higher in the winter and at nighttime. Solar is obviously generating in the daytime and more so in the summer because we're in the northern hemisphere. So they really do complement each other, and you need less storage overall, the more balance you get with those two. All right, I'm running out of time, so I will quickly go over some of these additional pathways. We looked at a few other things, just to sort of test around and see what that would look like. The first one is that what would happen if we leave some gas combustion turbines that are typically used for peaking. We leave them in what's called a mothballed state. So they're maintained and they could turn on if they're needed, but we only run them in case of emergencies. And what happens with that if we leave them only to meet those reserve margins? We don't actually use them at any point during the year, so they're not emitting anything. They're just literally just in case. So this was an interesting result because it just bumped down the amount of storage you would need. So you're not building storage that is just sitting around and not really getting used. And that really only changed the calculus for Georgia Power and Alabama Power. Mississippi Power's storage needs did stay the same. Their storage needs are actually driven by that daily load shape in both the summer and the winter ones, whereas Alabama Power and Georgia Power, a lot of the storage was driven by that reserve margin target. We looked at the no offshore wind case, which had a somewhat small impact because we weren't assuming a lot of offshore wind for Southern Company, but that it shifts that to solar and storage. And then we looked at what happens if there's no nuclear extensions. And there was only one case, one unit of Southern Company's fleet that has a current operating license that retires, that ends between now and 2035, and that's Hatch 1 for Georgia Power. And that's 463 megawatts. And again, that doesn't have a huge impact, basically drives Georgia Power to build more large-scale solar and storage. All right, conclusions and next steps. So first, 100% clean electricity, it's absolutely possible. There are actually several options that we have to get there. So, you know, what are we going to do? What are we going to use to get there? We also observed that two specific things make it easier to get to this 100% clean electricity. The first one is markets, and the second one, innovation. Markets, as I talked about earlier, you know, help with reserve margin sharing, among other things. And so being able to share resources really would reduce the amount of resources that the utilities overall would need to build. And then, you know, that makes it a lot easier and more cost effective to get to where we need to go. We've done previous analysis, SACE has done previous analysis that shows that the utilities across the Southeast aren't peaking all at the same time. So the ability to sort of pool resources and be able to, you know, help each other out in times of need is really something that has a lot of promise here in the Southeast. The second one is this idea of innovation. Sometimes there's, you know, a discussion around, do we have the technologies we need? Should we just invest in more in innovation and R&D? And then, you know, the other side of that is, well, we do have all the technologies we need to focus only on deployment and not invest in as much in R&D. The way we see it, it's not an either or, it's that we need both. We did do this analysis based solely on technologies that exist today, just to show, yes, it is possible, but obviously a lot of the potential for innovations, not just in new technologies, but also, you know, improvements to existing technologies. You know, the costs of wind and solar and storage continue to just keep coming down and down. And so, you know, keeping that up is really important. So we see it as, you know, not an either or, we need to be doing both of those things. This one was obvious from our results, which is that we're not at risk of investing too early or too much in these clean resources, especially energy efficiency, distributed solar, and anything that needs that, you know, time element, especially. You know, we're not going to just build, you know, too much solar over the next 5 years and oops, we don't need it all. That's just not going to happen. So this is something too that we didn't look at specifically in this analysis, but it is still super important, which is that electrification amplifies the impact of getting to 100% clean electricity. So we can just think this through. If we are cleaning up the grid while we are electrifying sectors that directly combust fossil fuels, such as transmission, transportation and buildings, we're obviously reducing emissions in all of those sectors and not just one at a time. So as I said at the beginning, this is this report and this analysis is intended to start the conversation going. More analysis on this is needed. This study, was a high level snapshot and, able to visualize what it would look like. But there are lots of areas we need to dig into deeper. And of course, this should absolutely be a part of every utility's resource plan moving forward. But before we get to all that, I think the next step is a federal clean electricity standard, or a clean electricity standard at the federal level. All right, so with that, I think we will turn it over to Kate, who's going to moderate our Q&A. Here's the contact information for myself and the team that worked on the report. If you have any questions that we can't get to today, feel free to reach out to us.
Okay, thanks Maggie for your presentation and your team's analysis. So just to kind of level set us on the Q&A, we'll start with a broader question and we'll point this back to Steve. Why is it important to get a clean electricity standard passed? And why do we need a clean electricity standard as opposed to going through regulatory processes that are already in place?
Well, thank you, Kate. The clean electricity standard is happening at the federal level. We believe that in our southern states, particularly the states that are in Southern Company, state governments are not leading by example or leading on the climate related issues. And therefore, we're not seeing them address this directly. There seems to be some partisan positioning on this issue, which is unfortunate because climate change doesn't know the various political boundaries. We also believe that while there is a regulatory apparatus in the Southeast at the state level, again, we're not seeing the kind of leadership that is necessary to solve the climate crisis through the regulatory mechanisms. Some states, particularly like Alabama, we sort of describe as having regulatory capture, where they're really not aggressive at all on, providing regulatory oversight for the utility, particularly on these issue sets. So having the federal government step in and set a standard across the country is critically important. Climate change is clearly one of the prime examples of market failure, where the external costs are not being internalized into the costs of how we generate power. We need to fix that market failure. Utilities actually will do best long-term in their planning if they have a clear regulatory and market signal. We believe that the Clean Electricity Standard sends that signal, and we believe it's time for this country to set that market signal and get the utilities moving in the right direction so they can do the proper planning to actually decarbonize the grid.
Thanks, Steve. And this next question is for Brian Jacob. He's also on this webinar today, and he is SACE's Solar Program Director, and he is working on a report right now, our 4th annual Solar in the Southeast report. So look out for that. It's a great companion to this report. But this question for Brian is, how realistic are your distributed solar assumptions? They seem very high.
Thanks, Kate. And thanks for the plug on next week's report too. Solar in the Southeast. Be on the lookout for it middle of next week. Yeah, so the distributed solar assumptions that we've made here are definitely realistic, definitely achievable, but they will require more than just incremental progress. This whole thing is about transforming the power generation sector. So I guess I should maybe explain, it's in the appendix, but how we got to them. We started with the Nrel solar potential study that was done back in 2016. It's probably the most comprehensive of distributed solar studies that have been done to date. It covers the whole country, but for each state, it lists a percentage of retail energy that could be produced by from rooftops. they analyzed what rooftops are suitable and what the maximum output would be from those. And we did not use that number. We used a much scaled down version, about a third of that number in our assumptions. So it's definitely realistic, and I would say to a certain extent even a little bit conservative in that regard. What might be playing into the question, though, is if people are looking at the appendix and seeing the actual magnitude of the capacity for each of our resources, there's not a huge uptick in what we're expecting on utility scale. For, say, Georgia Power, we're looking at about double the amount of utility scale solar, 2 to 3 times the amount, depending on the pathway, versus their current plan. But on the distributed solar, we're looking at 12 times. And that's not so much because of our endpoint expectation. It has more to do with the starting point and such a low level of distributed penetration for solar in the Georgia Power territory right now. It's less than 0.7%. So that's why there's such a gap there. And it may look unachievable, but it is certainly achievable.
Okay, thank you. And another question for you. Would utilities most likely need to retain renewable energy credits of customer-owned solar systems to get to 100% clean electricity by 2035?
That's a good question too. And the answer is maybe. Renewable energy credits are really just the accounting mechanism for who gets to make the claim about the renewable attributes of a renewable project. And Maggie mentioned at the very beginning of this all the different types of clean electricity standards that are currently being shaped in DC, and the different target percentages and the different deadlines. And they also have lots of nuances in terms of how they're executed. So right now, there's a lot of commercial and industrial entities that are procuring renewable energy using RECs through a virtual PPA, purchase power agreement, or a sleeved PPA or a green tariff, different mechanisms in different geographies, different jurisdictions. But there could very well be a case where under a clean electricity standard, the utilities have to retain the RECs in order to retire them against their mandatory commitment. And it just remains to be seen how the mechanics will work out of all the different CES proposals.
Okay, thank you. And let's switch away from solar and ask a question on nuclear. The question is, existing nuclear, will this entail no new plants and supporting decommissioning when the life of a plant has been reached without extending the licenses for extending the life of the plants? Nuclear is not carbon free.
Yep. So nuclear, we in most of our pathways, we assumed both existing nuclear remains online and gets its existing license extended. But we did look at that one pathway where licenses are not extended. I will say that we only looked at existing nuclear, and we did not have any new nuclear as an option in the different pathways.
Thanks. Okay. You mentioned that the reserve margin is driving a lot of capacity need relative to peak demand. Would most of the modeled battery storage be for meeting reserve margins rather than actual load?
Yeah, so this is another one that we looked at in one of those kind of alternate pathways, but we did find that most of the storage, so around 80% of the storage in the DER pathway is there for both. It obviously helps with the reserve margin, but it's used on one of those peak days. That doesn't mean it's used every day. In fact, it's probably not going to be used most days, but it is there to meet those peaks in summer and winter time. And then we did find, if we do leave some of the gas online, I mean, that could be any sort of other long-term storage, instead of that, leaving that gas mothballed, that case would allow for less storage overall to be needed.
Okay, thanks, Maggie. This question is for Steve, but I think Maggie can chime in if she'd like. Electric vehicles are set to increase exponentially. Does this report factor in the need for these additional electricity loads or needs?
Yeah, I agree that the electric vehicles are going to grow tremendously. I think a lot of people are underestimating it. My understanding is the report did use the utility zone load forecast. And so based on the planning assumptions that the utilities are using for the penetration of electric vehicles, I would just add that electric vehicle penetration doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to dramatically change the utilities load. I think the utilities can be proactive in using policies to encourage off-peak use of charging through electric vehicle rates and charging on off-peak times. I think all the utilities have plenty of capacity to do that. And so I think we're less worried about the electric vehicles causing problems for the load. It's more about making sure that we have the proper incentives to get people to shift their charging behavior so that it's in off-peak times. But Maggie, you may want to add to that.
Not a whole lot, nothing really to add, just that, yes, we use the utilities' own load forecasts. And so we're assuming whatever level of electrification that they are assuming. And those load forecasts are updated every year. And so as forecasts on electrification update, those get updated as well.
Okay, this one's a little bit long, so hopefully we can get to all of it. What is Southern Company's total capacity expenditure budget annually? How much of that is currently devoted to clean energy production? What is the approximate amount of annual investment in clean energy that you recommend under your plan? How do you propose for Southern Company to pay for that new investment? Finally, if none of that is realistic, is the real answer to promote rooftop solar or energy efficiency or other less centralized answers to the goal of carbon reduction?
All right, yeah, so there's a bit to unpack here, but this is a really good question. So the first bit on the figures of what is Southern spending on capital total and what of that is clean energy, I'm not sure. I don't have those numbers at my fingertips. They're probably in Southern Company's some of their filings, their 10K that they file at the SACE. So I'd encourage if you want to dig for those numbers, that's where I would start looking. But I think that it's pretty clear when we look at the current utility plans versus the pathway, that a shift away from investing in these fossil resources and obviously putting all of these capital budget dollars towards clean options is important for us to get there. And on the cost piece, I'll just kind of answer this a little bit more broadly because we didn't look at, this isn't a cost-based analysis, so we didn't say, okay, let's do a least cost optimization and this is the pathway forward. Those kinds of analyses are obviously useful in different ways. That's just not what we did here. That being said, we do think that the pathways that we presented here likely are lower cost than current plans. And Steve touched on a bit of this. Obviously, if you're looking at the costs that are being imposed on customers because of climate change, I mean, there's hundreds of billions of dollars already that's being spent because of extreme weather and because of these impacts of climate change. So the cost of inaction and not investing in these resources is just really huge. And then the other piece is obviously clean electricity resources are low cost. That includes rooftop solar, that absolutely includes energy efficiency, and includes centralized versions of those as well. And then the third thing is that these the clean electricity standard, those bills that were on the slide, they're not the only policy that's in these bills. They might be the centerpiece, but that's the stick, and there a lot of times there will be what are called carrots involved with that. So ways to encourage utilities to invest more in these resources, to invest in them in a way that is equitable and just, and also to ease any potential cost burden that would occur through this transition.
Thanks, Maggie. And let's pass it back to Brian for our next question. A clean electricity standard is a key element of the American Jobs Plan. How many jobs will this create?
I'm really glad we have a jobs question again today, because I did some homework last night, since there was a jobs question yesterday, and then on the earlier call today, there wasn't a jobs question. So now I have some more precise data points that I can contribute. The first of those is from February of this year. Evergreen Collaborative said that the power sector decarbonization could create a net increase of 500,000 to 1 million more jobs in the supply side energy sector in this decade, reaching 2.2 million in the 2030s. And then it goes on and says related jobs in energy efficiency could even double those estimates. And I will point out that I'm now quoting from other reports. These are not in the CES report that we're releasing right now. But we did have a question yesterday, and I winged it, but now I've got a little more that I can share. The second thing that I wanted to share is from Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. They estimate that transmission investment would create around 600,000 jobs by itself. Maggie talked about the need to expand transmission, particularly for bringing in Western wind. And they go on and say that wind and solar deployment enabled by the lines would create an additional 640,000 jobs to total 1,240,000 jobs. That was from a Forbes article just yesterday, so it's relatively recent. And then I would go back on solar, which is my space. The solar jobs census was released last month, and there are about 231,000 solar jobs in the country, or were for calendar year 2020. When they released those numbers, they projected that in order to fulfill a 100% clean electricity standard by 2035, as envisioned by the administration, would require 900,000 workers in the solar workforce. So roughly a quadrupling of what we have now. There's about 30,000 in the Southeast, and there's about 4,500 in Georgia. So if you think of a quadrupling of those are good numbers. So basically, I would use that just to say that a clean electricity standard is not just a clean energy opportunity, it's a job creation opportunity.
Great answer. Glad you had those numbers at your fingertips today. Okay, so I think we're a little bit over time, so I just want to remind everyone that we'll be sending out a recording for this webinar. So if you need to leave, that is okay by us. So this last question, I'll bring it to Steve to close us out, and Maggie can chime in if she'd like to. What are some potential barriers to getting a clean electricity standard passed, and what can we do to support it?
Right. Well, the most important thing is it's got to get through the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate and be signed by the president in order to become law. And so, as we all know, there's a great deal of partisan gridlock that is alive and well in Washington. And not all of that is in the country's best interest. And so there does appear to be one party that is less enthusiastic about working on the broad-based infrastructure and is less enthusiastic about working on carbon policy. And so either we're going to have to find a compromise that gets 10 Republicans to support the bill through regular order, or we're going to have to do it through budget reconciliation, which means that the Democrats may go it alone, and there may be a 50-50 split. The vice president would vote, and but there has been a process at work to look at moving the clean electricity standard through by budget reconciliation. It looks like there's a little less controversy on the House side. So the bottom line is folks need to engage with their elected representatives in order to assure that the clean electricity standard is not jettisoned overboard in the process of the sausage making of trying to get the bill. Communicate very clearly if you support this, that you would like to see a measure like this as part of the infrastructure bill. We've got to address climate change aggressively. And as Maggie pointed out, we need to get going now, even more aggressively than we are if we're going to get anywhere close to the targets that we need. And so it is a political process, and it does require constituent engagement.
Thanks, Steve. That's a great way to end the webinar, I think. And just to let everyone know, we do have an action where you can easily, in one moment, send an email to your member of Congress, and it's editable as well. So we will send that out along with the recordings for this webinar and the other webinars that we hosted yesterday and today. I want to thank all of our panelists for being on today, and of course for their analysis, and thank you all for joining us today. And we hope you have a great rest of your day.